Hey guys, welcome back to the Paladins Alliance. It's been a while, but I'm finally back with another video. There's a lot of things that I have planned, very, very big things, and I'm excited to share it with you. It's going to be a couple more weeks before I can finally announce it. But in between that, we've had a long tournament of ESL Pro League Season 15. We finally gotten to the playoff portion of the bracket. This is where things get a little bit more exciting. And surprisingly, we have quite a lopsided bracket with the bottom quadrant where having the bottom quadrant being the most stacked part of the entire tournament. A little cause for concern as far as I'm concerned with the state of how the playoffs are going to shape up. A lot of eyes are going to be on those Tuesday matchups. But I want to go through every single team. There's a lot of them, so let's get started right away. Just quick wire thoughts because I haven't necessarily given too many of them throughout the last couple of weeks. So I wanted to have just a compendium of thoughts to have everything just in one place and for your leisure throughout this next week. Starting with Heroic, I think they had a very good performance, something that I think they can be very happy with. They only dropped the series to Na'Vi in their group, and although they had a pretty easy group, all things considered, complexity showed signs of good signs. Go, same as well with them. EG didn't necessarily, but Astralis was definitely up and down throughout this tournament. Showed that they could go toe-to-toe with Heroic. And only dropping a series to Na'Vi is definitely no easy feat. And again, 100% win rate on LAN for Na'Vi it's kind of expected at that point. But they're still showing that they're a very competitive team. They still have what it takes to make a deep playoff run. First matchup against Liquid is always a good thing to have. And their side of the bracket could very well set up a BO5 with Na'Vi. And who knows, that could be a barn burner of a match if we can get that deep into the bracket. But the problem is that on paper, it always seems as though Heroic has an easy path to the grand final, but they aren't ever able to rise up to the potential. We'll talk about players later. Very similar story. But on the stats department, they still all look very sharp, and Staven continues his very hot form and sits pretty high up on the top players of this tournament, and he's really come into his own as far as his career is concerned. He's definitely gotten more consistent, and I think you'll definitely have all eyes on him to make sure that he continues that, because we haven't had that superstar performance in the playoffs just yet. And so this is the prime time for him to really do it. No real excuses for Heroic, all things considered. I have them making it to the grand final, and if they can't, then there's some serious mentality issues on this team that need to be considered. Obviously, we have Liquid on the other side of this bracket. Definitely a much tougher opponent than the rest of their group. But I want to talk just a little bit more about what I think about Liquid. Certainly, after making that video, a lot of the question marks that I had were kind of answered in emphatic fashion by this team. Shox looks a lot more comfortable in his more aggressive roles. And Nitro was outputting a lot more consistent fragging. OC is finally feeling the heat of Tier 1 opping, and he's performing pretty admirably. Allegiant Naf finally looked comfortable in a Liquid iteration after quite some time. So the level of this team has definitely risen from what we saw at Katowice, because frankly, it's going to be difficult to integrate a French player like that who has never had any international experience, at least on an international lineup, right? But they got out of their group. They showed some good promise. They had those dicey losses against Movistar and Players. Players was the series against Players was an absolute stomp, and the one against Movistar, it was definitely Movistar playing very well that day, but it was a very vulnerable series that just kind of slipped through the fingers of Liquid. But I've seen a lot of good signs from them, and they can definitely reach that top 10, but I don't know if they can go beyond that. I don't think we can really call this a top 5 team unless we see some superstar levels of performances from a myriad of these players, not necessarily just one or two. It can't just be the OC show. It's got to be a more consistent performance from the staples of the squad. Somebody like Elige is the player that specifically comes to my mind. Basically, the floor of this team needs to rise to meet up the highs of this team. And I don't think it'll be possible to do against Heroic. It's a very tall task against somebody like Cadian, who has such a well-oiled machine under his wings. And unless something miraculous happens, I don't really see it happening. But I'm definitely happy to see the level of chemistry that Liquid is finally showing, and they're definitely on the up and up. Don't count them out. internationally, but in this specific tournament, I think it's safe to say that they'll have a earlier exit. Let's move on to the next quadrant. I'll talk about the quarterfinalists at the very end. I wanted to just get these matchups done first. But let's talk about Fnatic. Somehow getting through their group was honestly a sight to behold. I wasn't expecting very much from them. They barely eked through the RMR qualifiers, which honestly I was highly expecting them not to make through that either, and expecting them to make maybe second to last place here, above looking for Org. But they managed to come out through that very difficult group, all things considered, with Pepzor Regali and now the newly trial signed Poison. And the major takeaway that I have to take from this team is the fact that Alex and Mezzi are basically inseparable and should not be removed from this organization. They're the bread and butter of why this team got out of the playoffs, or got to the playoffs in the first place. They have a lot to offer in the firepower department, and more importantly, they play so well off each other, and they always feel like a safe pair of hands to develop any kind of player. And I'm not necessarily impressed through Regali and Pepzor. They've honestly been pretty underwhelming in my opinion. They have a lot of development that they need to undergo in the tier 1 space. And Poison finally was able to bottle up the consistency that we've been trying to see him do, but he hasn't necessarily brought to the forefront. And honestly, that's why he was kind of hit or miss with complexity earlier on. But I have to stress that we need him to be that superstar that he was in the groups, or else this whole playoff concept is honestly just out the door. The matchup they also have isn't necessarily the best one. It's not very forgiving at all against ENCE. I expect them to kind of fall flat here. They had a very, very good streak of wins, but there's not really much to consistently talk about, as Fnatic is not necessarily a fully fledged team in my opinion right now. It's kind of just bits and bobs that are hoping to stick together, and perhaps this is just a bridge too far to cross. So good for Fnatic to qualify for the playoffs, but there just isn't much to write home about as far as a playoff contender, I should say. Compared to Fnatic's run in Group A, I honestly think that ENCE's run in Group B was much, much more impressive. It showed, I mean, honestly, that was the group of death that I was expecting ENCE to kind of flounder in with all the pressure that was placed on them, but they managed to get through, and hats off to them for doing so. Getting out of a group with outsiders, with Vitality and FaZe as well, and finally Furia, who I'll talk about later on, is definitely something that they should be happy about, and they should expect themselves to go a little deeper in this playoff setting, because the wins that they were getting were very convincing, starting off with that FaZe victory, and it showed that Snappy is still very, very intelligent, very capable of fighting against tier 1 opposition, and he's found a zone throughout that entire week where he was out calling on the T sides of a lot of these maps, and as we know, the T side is very, very difficult to break through, especially with how insanely OP the CT meta is as of right now. So having that already is a huge boon for any up-and-coming European team, and ENCE, with the amount of firepower that they have, with Snappy calling as well as he is, it's always a recipe for success. Madden, I definitely have seen signs of good things from him, but there's still a little bit of time for him to get a little bit more put into the roles that he wants, to play a little bit more aggressive and actually have those aggressive roles realized. And if those flashes of brilliance actually get a little bit more consistent, we could see ENCE really rise up the ranks, and they definitely have the potential to go deep in this tournament. Beating Fnatic is probably a given, in my opinion, as you can tell just through the way I'm talking about both of these teams. I think ENCE will safely get through this part of the playoffs. Quarterfinals, you're playing against a Movistar who doesn't have that much playoff experience under their belt. Pressure is always a huge conversation. And then again, you're going to have a difficult matchup regardless against the winners of NIP and Heroic. So it is possible to at least get a semifinal run. And perhaps if Snappy remains in that zone alongside the team, a grand final appearance will definitely not hurt the squad. So look out for ENCE. They're one of my dark horses for this tournament, and they have been for quite some time, with just the amount of raw skill that there is on this team. I actually wanted to talk about Entropic now. Let's move on to that next quadrant. The Russian squad that could. Their online results were all over the place. They couldn't qualify for the next season's conference, which is a little bit of a bummer, but that's to be expected with how just all over their online results were. I didn't have many expectations from them at this tournament because they're kind of on the downturn as far as the consistency is concerned, and they showed a lot of promise at the end of the year, but going into 2022 not able to qualify for the main event at Katowice was something that I was kind of disappointed in, but they showed up in spades at this tournament, and they showed that they still have the capability to have a deep roster and to make a deep run. Making the playoffs here definitely secures them as another top Russian team, and I hope that the world scenario allows them to play a lot more tournaments because they're a very, very talented team and they deserved to belong in Tier 1. Forrester had an incredible tournament. I was very surprised and happy to see that there's another consistent rifler on this team, because that's one big thing that I've been talking about. They have a very deep roster, and they have a very deep map pool, but as far as the actual skill and star level of this team, it's pretty shallow. Beyond Elian, you don't really have a reliable star player, and Forrester really stood up to the task at this tournament, and I hope he can continue that form. And moreover, I expect Elian to perform at the highest level possible, because this guy is a world-class player that isn't as consistent as I wish he could be. He deserves to be lauded as a top talent, but he can only be realized as such if he can play in these high-pressure situations, which he hasn't done so in recent memory. So I'm looking to Elian to put on a show, and if he can't, this lineup is going to fall apart, especially with how seasoned Astralis' members are. They might not be as capable as a squad as the previous iterations are, but they definitely have the tenure to actually go toe-to-toe in very high-pressure playoff situations that could catch Entropic off guard. I have Entropic winning this game in particular, but don't count out Astralis, who I'll talk about very shortly, about the amount of potential that squad has as well. So now that Farlig is out on Astralis, it's good to see that they finally have a little bit more of a consistent form. It's something that I had a huge problem with when Lucky was on this team, where I never really could understand what a potential ceiling of this team could be. And hopefully with Farlig on this team now, we can see what that potential ceiling could be. Getting through this group was something that I wasn't expecting them to do, especially with how close it was with Complexity. But they went against some very tough opposition, and they definitely hung around with them admirably. Playing against Na'Vi and both Heroic, they definitely pushed Heroic a little bit more, but showing that they could play against the top level teams this early on without Farlig actually being truly integrated in this lineup is great. We don't even need to see that superstar level performance from the Opera, but any little bit that he's showing is obviously markedly better than what Lucky showed previously on Astralis. And having Blame F consistently fragging, having allows Config to have a little bit more room to breathe. He doesn't have to have astronomical performances every game in order for them to win series. But it is welcome, and that's something that I've been noticing about Astralis, that when he is online, this team looks very, very, very good. And as we saw way back when at the Blastfall Finals, he was a big proponent of that during the studio-ish portion of it. And something that I want to look forward in this playoff tournament, whether or not he can keep up that pace. But Glaive also is getting more aggressive. I'm overall glad to see the form of this team finally starting to take shape. I'd like a little bit more consistency from Zipnix. He's starting to clutch a little bit more. But it's still very wishy-washy. I don't think that there's something that I can say definitively as to whether or not they're a top-level team just yet. I still think there needs to be time for them to develop. I expect them to make the quarterfinals, at least if you want to consider Astralis a top team with how close they kept it against Heroic, then it's kind of mandatory that they make it into the quarters here, and even the semifinals to go toe-to-toe with one of FaZe players or Na'Vi. But there is still the off chance that it just capitulates, because we've seen that happen before in some of these maps where there's a protocol in mind, but it definitely doesn't go according to plan. So there's a high skill ceiling in potential for Astralis, but as of right now, I can't definitively say if they're a top 5, top 7, top 8 squad right now. After the dismal start that FaZe had in Group B, I wasn't expecting them to get out of playoffs. It felt like they had kind of hit a hitch in their whole system. But Kerrigan and Cove definitely found the way to get out of that hole and qualify for the playoffs, by hook or by crook. And man, after the losses that they took, it seemed like they were kind of down and out. I explained on the live desk as well about how this team lives and dies off of Kerrigan. His roles that he has are very, very important, and if he isn't able to, live up to those roles, this squad can struggle to deliver consistent results just off of the fact that sometimes the firepower just isn't there always, right? Like obviously you have an outstanding trio of Fraggers and Broky, Twist, and Rops, and that's really the reason why we say that the ceiling and floor of FaZe have risen so much going into Katowice. But in all honesty, the consistency of the results that FaZe gets comes down to Kerrigan and his openings. Hopefully that they've been able to quell that. They obviously had a lot of wins that they racked up towards the latter end of the group, and that is definitely great to have going into a very intensive playoff bracket. Going into playing a BO3 against players, that's going to be a very difficult task. And then Na'Vi in the semis, and then I feel like you have a little bit better of a route. But if you get into the grand finals, then you'll have a chance of probably playing heroic. So there's no real easy task here for FaZe, but that's just how Kerrigan likes it. When the pressure is at its absolute peak, that's where I think FaZe do their best work, and this is where, champions are made, and that's why FaZe already have champions on their squad, and if there's any team to really break through this bracket, it'd probably be FaZe. Players had not necessarily the best group stage performance as I was expecting from them, especially with how well they perform in group stage situations. This one was easily a slam dunk for them with all the teams that were still in flux and how consistent they've been regularly. Obviously, I can't blame them with having to play in the scenario that they're in regards to their organization and whatnot. I'm sure that has at least something to do with it. But dropping a series to Movistar wasn't necessarily the best one, but they got outclassed in that matchup, and it definitely seemed as though they were out of sorts. But the map pool still seems solid. The team still looks solid. The players still look solid. Having Hobbit and Axel as your top two players is definitely something to be happy about, because Axel, I've talked about this many times, he's the reason why they were such a contender in the online stages and why they were such a championship contending team. Now here on LAN, we haven't necessarily had a performance like that from him just yet, and hopefully this is the one, because against FaZe, they're going to need every little bit of firepower that they could possibly get, and the IGL department, Nafany, has been struggling to frag a little bit, and moreover, against FaZe in the strategic department, Kerrigan has definitely shown that he's run circles around Nafany in the calling department. Think about Cologne, where he was just toying with him on LAN. The same could happen here, and personally, I think this is the worst matchup that players could have drawn in this entire playoff bracket and round one matchup. But they're going to have to find a way to power through. It's going to be a very great game to watch, I'd say. But I'm leaning over to FaZe mostly because of the intangibles, the experience that FaZe have in higher pressure situations. The fact that FaZe as a team has already overcome Gambit / players multiple times because of how Kerrigan has toyed with him and him being Nafany in the situation. And I think they'll have that in the bag. And regardless, Gambit is going to have a tough time. Even if they do find a way to beat FaZe, they have to play against Na'Vi, who, as we know, the rivalry on LAN has been very one-sided. Think back to that major semi. But there's a lot for players to overcome here. And if they're able to do it, this is going to be one for the history books, because it's quite a tall task, I'd say. So let's move on to those quarterfinal place teams, the first in their groups, respectively. NIP, the one in Group A, doing very, very well for themselves. Surprisingly, coming out top of this group with teams like Fnatic, teams like Entropic, G2, Mouse. These are teams that, while they obviously didn't perform at the same level, they had promised that they could definitely go toe-to-toe with the team like NIP, who still look like they're on the back foot, still trying to find their way without Device and with Fozy in this lineup. But after all said and done, they looked very, very clean in this group stage, surprisingly. I've been a very, some would say, a hater of this team, because just not having a full five-man led lineup, which I still obviously think is something that the org has dropped the ball in consistently with. I hope that can get fixed in the future, just because of the lack of messaging that the teams had. But that's another talk for another day. But besides that, DGL and Hampus have definitely worked together to create much better T sides for this team. It's something that they can finally rely upon without being freaked out with how difficult their CT side campaign has to be because of how laborious their T side has been. But getting this quarterfinal victory is quarterfinal placement is already a very big deal for me, especially going forward. Having Brolin on the team, I don't know if he's playing in this game specifically. If he is, that's going to cause some serious problems if they have to play heroic eventually, because Esatag is not necessarily the number one opper that I'd like to have in the situation. I don't think he has a very good track record. I'd rather have Fozy on the op. So I hope they play through that iteration all the way throughout. But if it is Fozy, then there is still definitely a chance for them to go toe-to-toe with Heroic. Great showing from them at EPL. I don't know if they're going to actually have quite the deep run. They have the bracket to do so, so there's an absolute chance for them to qualify for the grand final, but there are some dark horses in the tournament that I think could surprise Movistar and ENCE, obviously that side of the bracket, and of course Heroic is definitely going to be a tall task. So great placement, but I don't think I can see more from them going forward in this playoff bracket. Crazy showing from Movistar in this tournament. I was absolutely flabbergasted, especially attending ESL Challenger, watching all of those games and watching them play. They had a very, very dismal tournament, especially with all the potential that they showed going into the major and whatnot. Sun Pius had a very lackluster tournament at ESL Challenger, I'm speaking of, but very low impact. Didn't really seem like the team was very into it. And perhaps it was because of how Katowice was around the corner and that seemed more prestigious to them. At that tournament, they didn't perform very well either. I believe they didn't qualify for the main event there. But beyond that, as soon as they came into the EPL group, they hit the ground running. They had a lot of crazy good upsets. Getting a win over Players is no easy feat. Getting a win over Liquid was a very hard-fought battle. So going 5-0 in a group like that, obviously there are teams where you can run over, teams like Big and teams like Party Astronauts. Yes, that's what I was thinking of. But besides that, Movistar Riders had a very, very great tournament for themselves. Sun Pius finally started showing up a lot more. I was impressed with his metrics. His stats were definitely jumping off the page in that regard. Mopaz finally had a lot more of that aggressive gameplay being realized. That's something that I haven't necessarily seen happen all too often in the high-tier games that they have played. But his impact was definitely understated. Alex as well, showing that he's still in that conversation to fight against the other Alex, the British Alex. But overall, the team dynamic of this squad finally rose, and I definitely felt like they were much more cohesive, much more on the same page, and it felt like they had a game plan going into this group stage, and they passed it with flying colors. And what does that net them? It nets them a potential semifinal finish. Playing against the winners of Fnatic and ENCE is always something that you would definitely enjoy. Playing against a team that's around the same level or caliber as you are, and I don't know, it's just there's so much to offer from this team as far as the team dynamic is concerned. Not necessarily their firepower, which isn't that deep. It's just the chemistry that they have and the amount of reliability that they have between the four players beyond Sun Pius. And for that reason, this squad has the potential to do bigger and better things, start to play a little bit more consistent in the tier 1 level, and a playoff showing like this is outstanding. They can go for more. I think they definitely have the potential to do so. We've seen a lot of different pieces of content. Thorin talking about them being the dark horses, Haka doing a video on them as well. And I agree with the sentiment that they definitely have a lot of good pieces. That firepower might not be enough to, be a consistent top 10 squad, but they can comfortably rest in the top 20 for maybe the rest of the year with how they've been performing so far. Deepening their map pool could also be something to look at, but they have a good understanding of the maps that most teams don't necessarily want to play right now, and that's been a huge edge for them to win series regularly and why they're in the quarterfinals in the first place. So great showing from Movistar. Let's see if they can do a little bit more. The bracket definitely lends itself for them. Furia was another team that I was very surprised about, especially, again, at ESL Challenger. They were able to get to the finals, I believe, but at that spot where they played Virtus Pro, now Outsiders, they definitely struggled, and rightfully so. They definitely didn't look that comfortable in all of their outings, and even in this group, they weren't necessarily the most clean games from them. They had a very difficult group, nonetheless. They got at the top of the table in Group B, which is definitely the group of death in this situation. And that has to be applauded, regardless of how they got out. They got out at the top of the table, and now have a quarterfinal berth. And I think a lot of it has to come down to the safe pair of hands of KSR and Yuri. And their performance levels had kind of dropped before this, and they still somehow found a way to get back to that level that they were showing. Art's aggression and shenanigans were finally paying off once more, which is great to see that he's back into his old tricks, having the ability to wreak havoc with the high risk AWP, and Safe being that operator that can play the backlines, play a little bit more safer, is definitely a great sign. Safe on him, he definitely still has a bit of ways to get integrated in this lineup. It's a completely different style from anything he's ever played from before, and so that's going to take a lot of getting used to, a lot of autonomy that he's going to have to learn. He can't necessarily be spoon-fed or handheld throughout a lot of these rounds like he could have been on Pain, because that's just simply not how our Art calls. He likes a lot of separate autonomy between all of his players, so that could allow him to do a lot with what he wants to do. And so Safe is still learning to catch up to that fast-paced style of play. And if that is able to happen, then we could see them as a top 5 squad. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it really isn't. Because before when they had Henny, Henny was a very unstable AWP, but when they fought for their super highs, they were getting some deep tournament runs. And I think that it can be even more consistent if you have Safe also firing on all cylinders. I think you have a much higher ceiling if you have Safe on that consistent AWP. So outstanding finish for them. They can do one step better. I think they can go toe-to-toe with whoever comes into the semifinals if they keep that form of the highs that we saw of them in Group B. But I have a lot of big expectations, especially with how underrated I think KSR is. He's a star player in his own right. Yuri as well. And, you know, again, as I've talked about before in a couple of previews and whatnot, the player of Drop replacing Vinny, he could also have a much higher skill ceiling as time goes on. So a lot of potential for Furia. Let's see if they can actually get realized in this tournament. Finally, the big one, the one you've all been waiting for. It's Na'Vi, of course, the last team I'm going to be talking about in this video in particular. But they had an absolutely outstanding group stage with the substitution of Headtrick on this lineup. Simple absolutely going God mode. I believe he has somewhere around like 1.5 rating. Him having that kind of tournament in this setting is something that every single team should be fearful of, because if this guy's on, as we already know, it is going to be impossible for any team to beat them. Now, Boomich coming back in at the end, you saw how they absolutely ripped and tore apart Heroic in that last seeding matchup. Regardless of whether or not their hearts were in it, a win like that is still very, very impressive. They have a reasonable bracket to go through. Winner of FaZe players is something that is very doable. They can definitely beat FaZe, I'd say. Pound for pound, I think they have a little bit more firepower. You play against players, and we know how lopsided that rivalry is and how willing Na'Vi is to play in that matchup. And then again, the semifinal run through Tropic Astralis or Furia. It's a team, all teams that definitely have less experience at that high caliber of a level, at least in this day and age. So Na'Vi can definitely tear through that. And then you have a grand final with potentially the toughest team being Heroic in a best of 5. That's your bread and butter. You rip through that all together. So a very doable title run back for the CIS squad. Even with all the circumstances, them playing at this high of a level is so impressive to me. I think that hats off to them, regardless of what the future is of this roster, with what potential that, you know, maybe Electronic might not be on this roster. You know, maybe the other Russian players, I believe Perfecto, might not be on this squad. But if that can't happen, you know, it'd be a perfect send-off, because, man, the potential and the willingness to fight under all circumstances is just a sight to see. And I'm very, very proud as a Counter-Strike fan and enthusiast that we have a team like this to perform as they are in the world conditions that have been going on thus far. So that's all that I have in this video specifically. It's a little bit, again, a little bit less energy and not as in-depth as I was expecting it to be. But that's just because I have this podcast that I have been working on a little bit, and I'm excited to show it to you guys later on after I believe the first episode should drop a little bit after the ESL Pro League finals. And so once that is taken care of, you will definitely have a treat in store for you. I am so thrilled to talk to you about it. Honestly, I'm not one for surprises, but I think it'd be exciting to announce it a little bit later. So keep an eye on for that. So again, I apologize for the lack of content, but I hope you guys will understand after I drop the first episode of my new podcast. And I cannot wait to see you guys. And again, just follow my Twitter at Paladin for any bit of a nuanced Twitter takes during these playoffs. You can subscribe to my Patreon, patreon.com/PaladinsAlliance. Well, I will be doing a weekly question roundup, so look for that as well. And if that's everything, only you can subscribe to the Paladins Alliance. Peace.